Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for January 13th, 2023. Yesterday I gave a thorough report on the consolidation of global NATO, beginning with the merger of the European Union and NATO, which issued an official declaration proclaiming that the two of them are going to be coordinating activity on a world basis. Now, this means they've moved from a de facto to a full consolidation of an alliance as a war party to degrade Russia and China in defense of a global unipolar order. This is partly based on geopolitics, the idea of dividing the world into blocks, making an enemy image of countries that you don't like, and at the same time defending neoliberal economics, which is largely a policy of defending the City of London and the related financial institutions, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the institutions that represent the private banking and financial interests of the world's leading speculators. Now, in addition to the EU-NATO consolidation, there's a Japan-United Kingdom agreement, which allows each country to deploy their military forces on the other country's soil. This was proclaimed as the most important agreement between the two countries since 1902, which of course was a preface to the World War I alliance against Germany in particular, but against any kind of Eurasian perspective. Now, also, the U.S.-Japan agreement is being consolidated, which includes deployment of more Marines into Okinawa who are available for military deployment, including having access to cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and so on. Now, the targets of these global NATO deployments are nothing other than to not just contain Russia and China, but to defeat them as geopolitical adversaries, because they are sovereign nations which will not submit to the world order that's being dictated from Washington and London. Now, they're not fooling anyone with their talk about democracy, free markets, and so on. The nations of the global South are rallying in support of Russia and China because they have economic development perspective in common. They're joining institutions such as the BRICS, which is moving beyond the 5 initiating countries, with 17 more nations applying for membership. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the African Union, and others are all moving against the unipolar order, talking about a new financial system, a new payment system, a new finance system. And what's the purpose of the finance system? Cooperation among sovereign nations for economic development for the benefit of their people, as opposed to the benefit of the corporate cartels. Now, not only are they not fooling the former colonial nations, they're not fooling the Russians. And I just want to read to you from an interview with Nikolai Patrushev, who is the secretary of the Russian Security Council. This is a January 10th interview. What he said is, the Ukraine proxy war is, quote, a cover for a conglomerate of huge corporations that rule the U.S. and try to dominate the world. The U.S. authorities, allied to big business, serve the interests of transnational corporations, including the military-industrial complex. The assertive policy of the White House, the unbridled aggressiveness of NATO, the emergence of AUKUS military bloc, and others are also a consequence of corporate influence. And he said their goal is to preserve the system of global exploitation. So as I said, the Russians aren't fooled by what they're involved in Ukraine. This is not about Ukrainian sovereignty or democracy. If it were, then the United States wouldn't have run the coup in 2014. This is about protecting a system which is collapsing, the unipolar order, the petrodollar system, It's going into disintegration, and there's an alternative emerging. Now, the first question, and since this is Friday, I'm taking your questions. The first question is one that I received from many of you, which is, how do we defeat this corporate cartel? How do we defeat the World Economic Forum and those who run the security state, the media, and so on? Well, let's start with what their weakness is. They believe that they're the global hegemon because of their military power and financial power. But their financial power has been exposed by a whole series of bubbles that have popped since the end of the 1990s. The dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, the everything bubble between 2019 and 2021, and today the inflationary bubble. Their economy is collapsing. It's eroding. They're deindustrializing. They're undermining the actual source of wealth of the West, which has been productivity gains based on scientific and technological progress. And instead, everything is financialized. It's a speculative Ponzi scheme, which is protected by central banks printing money that becomes increasingly worthless. But what protects the system? The military power of the United States and NATO. So they may have liquidity, but they're insolvent. What they really depend on is your submission, your acceptance of the idea that they're all powerful and there's nothing you can do. Now, a solution to this, an alternative to this exists. This is what Lyndon LaRouche was involved in his whole life. For dealing with the debt situation, what he proposed was a debtors cartel. If the poorest nations in the world, and there are now something like 30 or 40 of them that are in deep economic problems with debt, one of which, by the way, one of the most indebted nations is Ukraine, which is getting more and more indebted every single day because of the weapon shipments to them. What LaRouche proposed was a debtors cartel. If you don't renegotiate the debt on decent terms and allow us to function as sovereign nations, we'll cancel the debt. That's something that nearly happened in 1982. It's something which represents the greatest threat to the global financial interests. Now, connected to that was his proposal for a new Bretton Woods, which is an economic system in which sovereign nations cooperate for mutual benefit and work out financing based on investment in those areas of the economy which produce real wealth, which includes extraction of minerals, it includes shipping, transportation, utilities, and power development, not windmills and so on, and also industry. But the decision has been made by the European Union and the United States to deindustrialize, and instead to do outsourcing and use cheap labor and cheap raw materials from other countries. The result of that, a pending global collapse. So LaRouche's proposal instead is that nations can get together and reach agreements that are mutually beneficial, that will provide credit for real physical productive activity. Now, our job, and the question was, how do we defeat the cartels? Our job is to create a growing public awareness of both their weakness and the global transformation that's underway as a result of nations rejecting the unipolar order. Now, it's hard for many people to believe that the allies of the United States and Europe are Russia and China, because we've been poisoned by toxic media and censorship into thinking that China and Russia are aggressive nations that are about to take us over. In reality, they're defending sovereignty, not just their sovereignty, but the sovereignty of the nations of the global South. They're not our enemy, but our ally, because their enemy is the same as your enemy, the global corporate cartel, which is moving to establish a cashless society in which all power goes through the central banks, a global central bankers dictatorship. That's what the Great Reset is. So that's the first point. We have a potential for an alliance with like-thinking nations And that's where we should be putting our effort, to educate people on what's wrong with the corporate cartels and why we have to have a system based on recognizing the sovereign interests and security interests of every nation. Now, a second question that I received more specifically is, what about the role of Zbigniew Brzezinski in setting in motion what we're seeing today with the confrontation with Russia and China? Well, Brzezinski is a product of a Harvard education through someone named William Yandell Elliott, who is essentially a British agent who worked at Harvard for many, many years. And listen to some of his students. Besides Brzezinski, there was Henry Kissinger, Pierre Trudeau, and Samuel Huntington, who drafted the Clash of Civilizations idea. Now, what Yandell Elliott represented was the merger of the intelligence interests of Chatham House, which is British intelligence, and the Council of Foreign Relations, which, for all intents and purposes, is an arm of U.S. corporate intelligence. Now, the key figure in holding a lot of this together is a British historian named Bernard Lewis, who wrote numerous books on the Middle East and was a mentor for Brzezinski. And Brzezinski's idea is that the wars in the future will be civilizational, that is, Islam against the West, pitting Hindus against Muslims in the Indian subcontinent, and so on. And he therefore came upon the idea of using Islamic fundamentalism against nations such as Russia and China. And that's exactly what the arc of crisis policy of Brzezinski was based on, which was an extension of the 19th century Great Game policy, which later morphed into British geopolitics. At heart, it's anti-Russia, anti-China. But why? Because Russia and China have an interest in building corridors of development between Europe and Pacific Asia, corridors of development which benefit all nations along those corridors, that are investing in the most modern sources of energy and physical production and transportation. This has been targeted since 1900 by the British as the greatest threat to the world empire centered in London. And it's this that Brzezinski took as his enemy, a potential of alliance between Russia and China. So his strategy was to try to degrade both and pit them against each other. Kissinger had a similar strategy, although it was a little different. Kissinger's was called balance of power. But what he said is, we can talk to Russia, talk to China, but just make sure that the two of them don't get together. Well, the worst nightmare of Brzezinski has happened with the Russia-China alliance for economic development. So that's the story of Brzezinski in short. Now we have a question from Michel in France about the Republican takeover of the House and the extended voting before it was determined that Kevin McCarthy would be the new speaker. Michelle asks, will the Republican takeover of the House affect the funding of the war in Ukraine? And if so, what effect would a cutoff of U.S. funding have on NATO and the war? Well, if we could stop the funds from the U.S., which is now somewhere around $112 billion, your taxpayer dollars, if you're an American, are going into an empty hole, which is money to the U.S. military-industrial complex, funding to consultants and various kinds of military-related firms, and into the pockets of swindlers in the Ukrainian government, which has been certified as the most corrupt government in Europe. And we hear also from the president of Nigeria that weapons that were supposed to go to Ukraine are now turning up in Nigeria in the hands of terrorists. Sound familiar? Remember Benghazi? So the question here is, what would happen if the U.S. voted to cut off funds for the war? The war would end. The Europeans would be under no compulsion to fund the war. The Europeans don't really want to do it, and they've been dragging their feet for legitimate reasons. but they won't stop because they're subordinate to the Anglo-American hegemony. So if we can cut off the funds in the Congress, then the war would end. And we'd have the capability then for a real peace based on negotiations for collaboration among sovereign states. Now that brings me to the last question I have time for today, which was a specific question along the same lines as Michelle. What can we do about a Republican senator who's totally committed to the proxy war? And this is someone who wrote to me about his Senator Rick Scott of Florida. And he asked Scott essentially, why are you funding this war? This is not in our interest. And here's what Scott wrote back. Quote, Russia is a cancerous, evil regime that threatens our national security by attempting to control as much of Europe and Eurasia as it can. And he says the U.S. must stand strongly with Ukraine and provide the lethal military aid it needs to win this war. Senator Scott, with all due respect, you're full of crap. Virtually everything you said in that letter is untrue. The idea that Russia is a cancerous evil for demanding security guarantees to protect its people, that's a cancerous evil. The idea that Russia is trying to conquer Europe and Eurasia, that's not true. In fact, who's trying to control Europe and Eurasia? It's the United States and the British. The idea that providing lethal aid to Ukraine will enable them to win the war, that's not true either. It ensures that there will be permanent warfare that could escalate to nuclear war. Now, what Scott represents is, unfortunately, a tendency among Republican senators, such as Cruz, Hawley, Rubio is the other one I'm thinking, not Hawley, Cruz and Rubio. But there are a whole bunch of these Republican senators who are committed to the military-industrial complex. And in that way, they are essentially working with Biden. They're an example of the Republican side of the unipolar party, one party. And the Democrats and Republicans have consistently voted to provide the aid that Biden has asked for to continue this war. So the fact that you have a few House members among the Republicans who are starting to speak out is a good sign. But the problem is, as long as you have people like Scott in there, you need a change. Now, if you disagree with what Scott is saying, then work with us. Educate Americans on what the real cancer is, which is the corporate cartel order, also known as the Unipolar Order. Now, what is Scott's role in this? This is very interesting. He was the CEO of Columbia HCA, which was the largest for-profit healthcare association in the United States. This came out of a merger between Columbia, which he organized, and the Healthcare of America. And interestingly, the company was convicted of 14 felonies, including defrauding Medicare and Medicaid. So that's a little bit of the sense of who this guy Scott is. He's a perfect example of what's wrong with having power granted to the corporate cartels, such as big pharma, for-profit healthcare, and so on. So he's up for re-election in 2024. You want to do something about this? Find a candidate now who's honest and committed to the true American system, not the fraudulent one of the Republican free marketeers and neocons and warhawks, but one who's committed to the idea of investing in the future of the United States using the economic solution that I presented earlier, developed by Lyndon LaRouche. Now, tomorrow, January 14th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, we will have a panel discussion under the title Stop NATO's World War, Dismantle the International Assassination Bureau. Those so-called deep state networks that are international, that were responsible for the murders of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, but also people around the world. and are still operating today through such organizations as NATO's Committee to Combat Disinformation in Ukraine, which has a kill list to silence opposition to the war. So tune into our event. You'll have in the description box below, a link to it. Thank you for your questions. There were a lot of interesting ones, and I'm sorry I had to just limit it to these few. But join us again Monday. Get your friends active. Sign up for the notification of the LaRouche Organization site so you won't miss anything in the future. So thanks for joining me. Have a good weekend. Join us tomorrow, and I'll see you on Monday.